Pleased to have with us today Rania Abouzeid. She's based in Lebanon, and many of us have read her work on Syria. She's been reporting, though, on the Middle East and South Asia for 15 years, now working as a freelance journalist. She's won several awards for her Syria coverage. She is one of the few reporters that has been inside Syria throughout the conflict. And I think your last visit inside Syria was in August, is that?
Yeah, late August.
Late August. So since the uprising began in 2011 until almost presently, she's been working inside Syria. So we're delighted to have you with us here in the U.S., in Washington, and to be able to benefit from your insights into Syria. I think that there could be two strands of discussion with Rania. One, of course, is about the challenges of covering violent conflict and what that takes as a person, as a journalist. But then there's the other part of what's happening inside Syria. There was recently an interview with Rania by Jadalia. It's a very good interview, and it's about the issue of covering conflict, media, women, and coverage. So I'm going to let that stand as one opportunity for people to learn about the challenges of reporting on Syria, and use this time really to focus on trying to get a handle on what's happening inside the country. And I want to start off with a discussion, a little bit of a discussion about sort of the trajectory of the conflict. Originally, Syria started off as this popular revolt around the time of Egypt and Tunisia. You were covering both places. And so there was, of course, this triumph of people rising up against an authoritarian regime, and then there was the armed insurgency, and now what we're seeing is a multi-front battle, a very complicated one with different armed actors, continued regime activity. And I just ask you, Rania, to maybe reflect a bit on what you witnessed in terms of the conflict's transformations and sort of some of the benchmarks for you in that process.
It's a big question.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for the invitation to New America Foundation. As you mentioned, I covered the uprising in Tunisia and then in Egypt. And it was in late February 2011. My editor asked me if I wanted to go to Benghazi, which at the time had just opened up. And I told them that I wanted to go to Damascus and see how this state was reacting, if at all, to the changes that were happening in the region. I was in Damascus in late February 2011, and I saw the first sort of rumblings of discontent in the capital. And they were small candlelit vigils, and they were in solidarity with the Libyan people. They had nothing to do with requesting the fall of the regime or anything like that. And, I saw how the regime reacted to them, how its various security forces were out in great force trying to intimidate. And these very small gatherings, there were only about 200 people, the first one in Damascus. And from then, things started to progress. I remember walking in nighttime demonstrations in the areas around Damascus, and how there was a liveliness, a cadence, there was an energy to the Syrian protests that I hadn't seen in Tunis or in Egypt. There was this incredible energy, and the chants. It was in the chants. They were very musical. The cadence would sort of shift with the chants, and I remember that when I was walking with those demonstrators, very few of them flinched when the bullets started to fly. In those early days. I remember that clearly. There were men, women, children out in force on the streets. That was the early days. Very different picture now.
But it's very interesting to think that they were steadfast so early on.
I think it was clear from the beginning that it was going to be existential for both sides. I remember speaking to some of the people who were out in the streets in those early days, and they said, listen, you know, when we leave our homes, we know that this is it. If we don't continue in our path, we may be hunted down. They knew from the beginning that this was going to be existential on both sides, and the regime from the beginning was also. I mean, this was a fight for survival for both elements.
And so then, when it turned into an armed rebellion, it probably wasn't surprising, given the violence that the regime used against the demonstrators and the determination and the feeling of it's all or nothing, in a sense.
When it started to militarize in the summer of 2011, and there was a town in the north, a town called Jisr al-Shughur, and that's where we saw the first real sort of organized pushback, and they were civilians at the time, the people of the town who fought back basically, and they attacked the security and military installations in their town. This was a town that also had a long history with the regime back in the 80s, along with Hama. There was a bit of an Islamist sort of uprising in this town, and it was crushed. So the people who took part were the sons, the grandsons of the people who remember what happened in Jisr al-Shughur in the 80s. But after that, that was the civilian side. But for the most part, they were defectors. And I remember being with some of the earliest groups of defectors, and they were adamant that they didn't want armed civilians with them at the time. They wanted it to remain. They wanted to maintain some form of military discipline, if you like, and they didn't want civilians to join them. But after a while, as the killing continued, as the bloodshed continued, they started actively requesting civilian assistance, and that request was made, you know, over mosque loudspeakers. It was made in amateur clips uploaded to YouTube, and we started to see, you know, more and more people take arms. And in the beginning, they were just locals. They formed what was called a Katiba battalion, although it didn't correlate to the military definition of the word. They were basically, you know, a guy, his cousins, his sons, his neighbors, local men who formed these groups. And with time, some of these battalions started to coalesce into larger groups. And they started to coalesce around geography or around ideology, in some cases both. And then we started to see the multiple groups acting and still fighting for the regime. And when did it turn into what we think now is a battle between armed groups? You know, let me step back a second. In the summer of 2011, the so-called Free Syrian Army was announced. The formation of this group was announced. It was a group of defectors who announced this. It was never an army in any sort of, you know, organized sense. There was never any command and control. And this is something that I and many people have stressed in our reports. It was just sort of a loose franchise outfit, an umbrella term under which these groups could organize without being seen to be unregulated militias, if you like. So, you know, people started to identify themselves as Free Syrian Army. There were other groups as well, even from the very beginning, who were outside of this umbrella term. And they tended to have a more stridently Islamist ideology, although there were groups within that identified themselves as Free Syrian Army who were also Islamist by nature. That's a very broad term. I just want to say it's a very broad term. There's an entire spectrum within Islamism, so they're not all the same. I want to stress that. So we started to see other groups as well forming. In January 2012, we saw a group called Jabhat al-Nusra, which announced its presence inside Syria. It's also widely known now that it is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, but it didn't announce its presence until January 2012. And even from the early days, when after Jabhat al-Nusra announced its presence, there were groups within the armed Syrian opposition who made it clear that they didn't agree with its ideology. They didn't agree with the type of Syria that this group wanted, but that they needed them. And I often heard that from many fighting men. They would say, listen, you know, we don't agree with the kind of Syria that these guys want, but we need them now, because these were the men who came and said, you know, not only will we support you, but we will support you by fighting and bleeding and dying with you. which is more than any sort of assistance that they got from other groups, other people, other sides. So, you know, they were never sort of united. It wasn't as if they were united, but it was like a marriage of convenience, if you like, for many people. Not for all. Many of them warmly welcomed them. They agreed with their ideology, and they appreciated the assistance. But the fighting, like all of this, came out into the open more than a year ago. Actually, it's you know, it's become deeper now over the last, I'd say, 6 months. But it's been more than a year, and it was the rivalry was played out on low-level sort of things, like the assassination of a particular commander. One group would overrun the checkpoint of another. There were these small sort of things that we would see, and with the declaration of ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq, in a sham, which was another Al-Qaeda affiliate, it identified itself as Jabhat al-Nusra's parent organization in April of this year. When that came to the fore, that's when we really started to see the very intense intra-rebel rivalry.
And so you witnessed this firsthand. Is it? I mean, how do Syrians on the ground now, the ones who took up arms originally to fight for their town, their village, their country, how do they see the presence of these foreign fighters or these radical elements? How are they relating to them? And you know, do we have any sort of sense of what their future is in Syria?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that